I'm Brian Lacey, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Ireland's queer history, particularly the queer history of Gaelic Ireland. Um, you can divide the history of queerness in Ireland into two, from the year 1634. In the year 1634, an act was passed, an act for the punishment of the vice of buggery. And that's the only law that has ever been passed by any parliament in Ireland, north or south, east or west, dealing with, if you like, anti-gay, anti-queer, anti-homosexual. And a pretty bad law, apart from anything else, if you can see on your screen, it actually condemned people to death, shall suffer such pains of death. So if you were found guilty of this, you were liable to be hanged. And really since then, since 1634 or thereabouts, we have a kind of a different gay history or queer history in Ireland. What I put on the screen here is a whole list of scandals or court cases, and these all follow on from the law of 1634. There was one slightly before it, which actually led to the passing of the law. But each one of these incidents on the screen, in fact, we could spend hours talking about each one of them separately, but they deal with kind of colonial Ireland since the mid-17th century, when that law, the 1634 law, was in effect. That law was passed in Ireland exactly 100 years after the same law had been introduced in England by Henry VIII. Now, before that, however, before the 1630s, the situation in Ireland was very different. There was no law against homosexuality or queerness or anything like that, although, of course, the church had its rules. And for much of that time, the church was, if you like, an institution of the state. Irish history, and by history, I mean the written record, the record of past events as read in writing, goes back to St. Patrick. St. Patrick wrote what are in effect the oldest documents in Irish history. And this is a copy of them. This is from the Book of Armagh, which dates to about 800. And it's the so-called Confessio or Confession of St. Patrick. And it's the oldest text we have from Irish history. And in it, Patrick tells a story. You remember that Patrick was kidnapped as a slave, almost certainly from Britain, brought to Ireland when he was 16, spent 6 years in Ireland, and then as a 22-year-old young man, he tried to get away from slavery and go back to Britain. And he tells us in his own confession that he went to a port on the Irish coast and he tried to get on board a ship, but the sailors refused to let him on because in the Latin there at the top, I refuse to suck their nipples on account of the fear of God. Now, all sorts of explanations have been given for this expression, but it seems to me that the most obvious thing is that the sailors asked Patrick to have some sort of homosexual sex with them, and in return for his passage back to Britain, and he didn't agree. Now, the important thing about that is, of course, is that this is the very, very first text in Irish history. And yet already there it is, a reference to a queer sex. Men sucking each other's breasts or nipples is not confined to St. Patrick. There are various other texts, and I just put a few. There's a text about another saint, actually from County Antrim, Culamon Elena, and he it says he has a tit or a nipple for two boys, Buahin and Olthon, and they're kind of fed from sucking his tits. And then there's in the introduction to the Seanachas Mór. The Seanachas Mór is the great collection of law tracts from early Ireland, and there's a reference there to a dwarf, Fergus. Sorry, a dwarf who sucked the breasts of Fergus, and Fergus was an historical Ulster king. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make really is that there are several texts anyway, dealing with men sucking each other's breasts. Now, the greatest inheritance we have from Gaelic Ireland is the Irish language. And people might be surprised, but the Irish language is full, or very rich anyway, in words for all sorts of queer sexualities. And I just put a whole list of them there on top. And these are just some. This is just a sample and the one I'm always amused at myself. I've highlighted there. Is it there in bold? Is Kigaratonic, and those of you who know Irish will know that this means literally an arse inspector. So it's kind of appropriate. But there's no shortage of words in the Irish language to describe homosexual, gay, or queer behaviour. There are very odd things around Ireland, such, for instance, this is a church on the Aran Islands, known in Irish as Champlain Catharawl, the Church of the Four Beauties. And the four beauties in question are they're all male saints. Now, that doesn't tell us very much, except it's a bit odd. Now, Ireland has the oldest factual and fictional literature in Europe, with the exception of the classical writings from Greece and Rome. And what is very clear is that there are lots and lots of texts which talk about same-sex relationships, and also describing how particularly men describe the physical attractiveness of other men and love and intimacy between them. We have to be very careful about using, of course, modern LGBT plus terminology, because it's very different in our life. But one thing is absolutely certain. From the very beginning of recorded history, that is, with the text of St. Patrick, homosexuality and queerness is reported as a relatively common fact of contemporary life. Now, as you, I suppose, might expect, most of the texts deal with men rather than women. Lesbianism it does occur, or at least is reported in the text, but it's rare. And this is a very early piece here. Unfortunately, this is the sum total that we have, but it's from the mythological stories about the Tuatha De Danann, who are the Celtic gods of Ireland. And Anya, the daughter of the Dagda was the great god, the big god, the most important god. Anyway, Anya, his daughter, died for the love that she gave to Bamba. And Bamba is described as the wife of Maquil. So this is a lesbian relationship. And unfortunately, we don't know much anything else about the story other than that. One of the interesting sort of cultural practices in ancient Ireland was the way children were educated, particularly amongst the aristocracy. They were sent out to be fostered by other families, and that fosterage could last up to sometimes their 14th year, sometimes it went on to their 17th year. But the law tracts describe how intimate relationships existed, quote, between a foster brother of the same cup and of the same blanket and of the same bed. So these are teenage boys who are sleeping with each other in the straightforward sense of the word. And while there's no specific evidence that anything sexual, particularly sexual, happened, one has to say that it would be almost unbelievable if sex of some kind, sexual exploration, didn't take place. And what we do know is that very strong love relationships developed between these boys who were foster brothers. And the most famous episode of that is the famous myth or legend about Cuchulainn and his foster brother Ferdia. They were foster brothers together, and of the same cup, of the same blanket, of the same bed. And of course, in the story of the famous story of the Tombo Cuchulainn, Cuchulainn eventually kills Ferdia in a kind of a great tragedy, and then he cries out this great poem of love for his foster brother. So this poem is being, as it were, spoken by Cuchulainn about his beloved Ferdia, that well, not so much accident, but tragically he had just killed. So it's a very strong expression of love between two males who are not related by blood in any way. One of the things that we've become aware of in the last few years have been archaeologists. I'm an archaeologist. And archaeologists have begun to find same-sex burials of particularly men buried with each other. Now, these have only really come to light in the last 10 to 20 years or so, and There's one there in a place called Knoxpark in County Sligo on, and then another recently has come up just outside Roscommon town. Now, it may well be that these have been found all along, but nobody, if you like, admitted that they were burials of same sex, or at least they didn't explain them in a homosexual way. But in this instance, I suppose because Irish society itself has become more accepting of homosexuality, archaeologists have begun to explain these same-sex burials as homosexual relationships. We know that in ancient Ireland, indeed right across Europe, but I'm concentrating on Ireland, there was a particular kind of interest and wonder at the relationship described in the Gospels between Jesus and St. John, the Apostle John, the man who wrote the Gospels. And as you know, at the Last Supper, there's a description that one of his disciples, John, whom Jesus loved, was lying close to the breast of Jesus. Now, there's no specific sexual contact, but this episode becomes of great interest in Ireland and indeed across Europe. And in fact, it's expressed in all sorts of works of art. But in Ireland, it took a particular form. And the word for a breast is bryn in this instance, and Owen of Rinnell, John of the Breast, becomes his name. And the word then develops, for instance, Brindalt, a favorite student, and so on. And that relationship between John and Jesus is used as a symbol, if you like, in a symbolic way, to describe the relationship between the church and the people. But the language used is the language of passionate love. And here's just a poem, for instance, short poem. This is a description of John. Thou art the apostle dearest to him, dearest to Jesus. Though he loved them all, he fondled thee on his own couch, and so on and so forth. And Jesus, then he gave thee his secrets. His knee was thy pillow. In other words, Jesus's knee was the pillow for John. And there's another one just for John. This is like it's like an impressionist. It could be describing a young pop singer, kind of, and it talks about John as a beautiful young man, very angelic John, calm, beautiful haired, bright-eyed, blue-eyed, purple-cheeked, beautiful face, bright, so on and so forth. All these kind of wonderful things, that he is very good looking. And of course, these were all written by men, and in this instance, they're used to describe the Apostle John. It seems slightly bizarre, but nevertheless. There are lots of stories about gender bending in Old Irish, in the Old Irish text. This is one about an abbot of the monastery of Drimna in Dublin. Drimna is a kind of a housing area in Dublin. There was an ancient monastery there. Anyway, the abbot of Drimna goes out and he met a group of fairies who change him into a woman. And that woman married the abbot of a neighbouring monastery, actually the monastery of Crumlin, if anybody knows Dublin. Crumlin is near Drimna. And they gave birth to, in some cases, some stories say 3, others say 7 children. And then 10 years later, the man changed into a woman, changes back into a man again, and she goes back to he or she goes back to their monastery in Drimna. Now, this is the actual text of the story. It comes from the Book of the Book of Fermoy, which is a medieval Irish text. And I won't go down to the whole story, but just to say that that story exists and is well known, and I've sort of highlighted it there. There are also lots and lots of stories about men making other men more beautiful. And here you have a story of one St. Patrick. He meets this man, Owen, whose name is given to the Inishowen Peninsula and County Tyrone. And Owen is kind of thinks of himself as not being very good looking. So he asks that Patrick changes him into looking like Riach. And Riach is literally, legendarily good looking. So Patrick tells them they should sleep in bed under the one cover, one blanket, and then the following morning when they get up, the ugly man had turned into as good looking as the other man. And there are lots of stories like this. This is another story about 2 monks, actually described as saints from County Meath, Carnoch and Keenan. Carnoch, Carnoch arrives and he wants a bath. So Carnoch says to let's get into the bath together. So to get into the bath, and then Keenan says, Carnoch says, that's a beautiful body you have, Keenan. And so on, the story develops. Anyway, this is the point, if you like, of two men having a bath and admiring each other's physique in the bath. Is basically what the story is. Now, this is another story about a lovely young boy or young man, Down Bow. And Down Bow is a harpist. He's a professional harpist for the king. And in this story, which is a real historical, the event anyway, Battle of Allen in 722, in which a king from Donegal goes down to Kildare and fights a battle. And on the way, he collects this boy harper in somewhere around Carrickmacross. And the description of this boy again is he's like a young male pop singer, beautiful, good-looking, beautifully dressed, and all the rest of it. And the little poem that goes with it says, "More lovely than all the boys, dear Down Bow, more sweet a song, etc., etc." Now, all the stories I've been telling so far have been taken from, if you like, fiction or semi-fictional literature, but we also have direct historical evidence. This is the territory of Dalnorage. This is Belfast, just there. So there's Bangor, and in a king from there, or rather a man who is going to become king from there, is brought by a monk to an island in Scotland. And it's basically a dirty weekend because the monk is interested in the young man, and he asks a bishop to come and ordain the young man a priest. But the bishop is reluctant to do so because he realizes, in the words in Latin, "Aidem carnaliter aman sum," Fincan's love for aid was earthly. And this is the actual manuscript here. Fincanus aidum carnaliter aman sum. Fincan's love for aid was carnal or earthly. So that's, and by the way, we don't know anything more about Fincan, but we do know more about Aid, and he becomes an important king, in fact, a kind of a slightly evil king in. Now, along with all of that stuff, we have a series of texts in Old Irish called the Penitentials, and the Irish seem to have invented these as far as we know, and there's about 6 of them from the period from about 600 to 900, and basically they're lists of sins with the appropriate penances. And here's just one. They deal with all sorts of sin, but sex, of course, rears its ugly head in lots of ways, and homosexuality particularly. So boys talking alone, boys, those who kiss simply, those who kiss licentiously without pollution, that's without ejaculation. But if with pollution, ejaculation, then their penance goes up, and so on and so forth. This is an interesting one here. This is another one, the Penitentials, and this is in Latin here, but it's the only one that refers to women, because it says men who fornicate from behind in terga or between their thighs, they have 2 years penance. And then it says similarly, women or girls who do the same who do the same thing, they get the same penance. And that's one of the rare references to women. Now, I just kind of correlated, if you like, all of these. And here you can see, these are the list of sins. I'm sorry, part of this is in Irish because I sometimes give this lecture in Irish. So you have intimate sex talking, kissing licentiously, kissing with ejaculation, mutual stimulation, masturbation, mutual romance, intercourse between the thighs, fellatio, oral sex, and then anal intercourse. And there are distinctions in the Penitentials between boys or children rather under 10 years of age, between 10 and 12, between 12 and 20, and over 20. And as you grow older, the penance, of course, gets more serious. Now, we don't have any very little visual representation of this, but some things are odd. Like, for instance, this is in the Book of Kells, and you can see there the penis of the animal has been shown very graphically. Here's another one where the penis is shown maybe more graphically than is necessary. And it's not only animals. Here's a man. It's very hard to work them out, but there's his head, and there's his body, his legs, and there's his penis shown quite clearly. And here's another one in this corner. This is the same guy here, and there again is his penis and testicles. So they're showing the sexual organs of the person. And this is one where they've censored it. They've actually blocked it out, because we think, or rather, we now think that people in the 17th century thought that this was Jesus, and you couldn't be showing the penis of Jesus. So they blocked, or they censored it, but we now know in fact it's not Jesus at all. And the Book of Kells then, and other manuscripts, are full of these kind of pictures here, where you have two men pulling each other's beards. And again, there's nothing overtly sexual about it, but the interpretation is that this is somehow or other referencing sex between men. And you'll notice that they're all blondes. Here's more of them here. They're all blondes. So it must be true that blondes have more fun. And this is an interesting one. This is from the first page of the Gospel of St. Luke in the Book of Kells. And down in the corner, there's all sorts of things going on here, drunkenness, stealing, things. But here are two men who are almost certainly engaging in some form of sexual activity. Now, the Book of Kells, of course, is not a book of pornography. It's essentially a book of the four Gospels. Here are two angels at the same thing, whatever they're at. And by the way, this is a cross, very hard to see, but this is a cross up in Inishowen, up near Carndonagh. And here it's the same two men engaging in what might well be some form of sexuality. Now, of course, they're not depicting sex for its own sake. They seem to be depicting sex as sin, that these are really images of sin. There's a strange thing in a strange story told in the Book of Leinster. The Book of Stanster is a 12th century story, but it's telling a story about a real king called Neil Frossock, who lived in the 8th century, died in 778. And the story is telling us really how wise a king this man, because a woman comes to him and she's just had a baby, but she claims that she's never had sex with a man. So this is a puzzle, and Neil is a wise man, and he figures out the puzzle. And he asked the woman directly, well, have you ever had sex with a woman? Lánavnas Rauartha is the term there. And she says, yes. And he says, well, that woman had just come from having sex with a man. So the man's sperm was transferred to the first woman, who then transfers it to the second woman in the context of their sexual relations. And this is then, the story is told not to bring disgrace on the women, but in fact to show how wise a king the man was. Now, the woman, the word used in those texts for sleeping with or having sex with is feis. And we all know feis is a common word nowadays, meaning usually musical and dancing competitions and things, but its original meaning was sexual. It meant to spend the night with, to sleep with, to mate with. You can use your own words. It was also, by the way, sorry that's in Irish, but it was also used as the description of the inauguration ceremonies of kings, and that was to indicate that these were really fertility rituals. Bedfellows, there are lots and lots and lots of stories of men sleeping together. Now, we know that in medieval times people slept together just for warmth, apart from it. So again, we can't claim that all of these were sexual, but it would be very unusual if some form of sex didn't occur. And of course, it wasn't confined to men. St. Bridget, according to the legends, had her own favorite nun and bed companion. I'm going to rush through these. The poets who wrote about these were sort of descendants of the Druids of ancient times. And many of them, they write poems about their own sex, and men writing about their own sex, other men. And in these, they describe themselves often as the lovers or the wives of the men in question. And this is a really interesting, and there are texts of this nature I have there at the bottom of the screen from all these centuries right through Gaelic culture. The most famous of these was probably this man. Sorry, here, his name, Yucky O'Hosa. He was the court poet to the Maguires of Fermanagh in County, and he was an exact contemporary of William Shakespeare. You can see there his dates. And Yucky was, I think we would now describe him as a screaming queen. He was a very gay man who was madly in love with not just one man, but with many men. And in his poems, he describes this, and here's a poem he addresses to his chieftain, Hugh Maguire, calling him my darling spouse, the fine, pure white breast, the pillow on which I rest, and so on. Here's another one, he to another chieftain of Fermanagh, Cuchonach, and he describes, you know, Cuchonach is away at the wars, and he said, so Yucky is saying, I'm sorry I'm not with you. It would be no misery for me to be with him, elements piercing my body in a bare house under the same quilt. In other words, I would experience any cold and damp and whatever, as long as I was able to sleep with Cuchonach. And if he and I shared a bed, I would heed no hardship, and so on. Whatever bed we lie upon, in the desire of my mind, our bodies cling together, although Ireland is between us. Yucky is in County Fermanagh, while Cuchonach is actually down in Kinsale in the south of Ireland. And here's another one. This is one I like best. Yucky spends a weekend up with Sir Shane O'Doherty of Inishowen, who he spends this kind of weekend, as a little holiday up there with him. And when he comes back to Fermanagh, he writes this poem, which is effectively a thank you letter, but it's also a love letter. And he describes, my misery of mind is the measure of my love for a slim, gentle body and the time I spent with him. And then he directly addresses Shane O'Doherty. Your directness of mind, your pleasantness, your gentleness, your youth have enchanted me. Your kindly gifts and your love beguiled me in a way I did not expect. I have no regret that I'm beguiled like the women of Ireland. I part not from effeminacy. Yucky, the poet here, who is expressing his love for Sir Sean O'Doherty, gets land. He's the end of the Gaelic poets, if you like. He's one of the last of the Gaelic poets of old Ireland. And he gets land under the plantation scheme in County Fermanagh. And but then, if you like, the culture that he represented all dwindled away. So within 30 years of this poem being written, we have the enactment of the law. I started out with the law for the suppression of buggery and what have you. And the whole of Irish culture changes. Gaelic Ireland seems to be broadly accepting of queerness and homosexuality, but a new regime comes in, and with it, those kind of things are now made to be crimes against the law. And from then on, if you like, it's a totally different story. So I'm going to finish there. And if you want to read more about this, you can read it all in my book, Terrible Queer Creatures. Thank you very much for listening to me.